If you're okay with a maid, I'll give you my address. The one mocking me over the phone was my husband's daughter, Maggie. For 15 years, I had been the one almost solely supporting our family. I've got a job now, so I don't need your measly salary. We can live just fine with Dad. And we can return the slacker housewife. I wasn't neglecting my household duties, I had simply delegated a portion of them to my husband. Despite this, I had continued to forgive Dan. Even though he was unemployed and would spend all the allowance I gave him. Then it's divorce for the jobless loser husband. Upon my declaration, Maggie made a strange noise, unemployed. When Dan took the phone, he laughed as if he had won something. Hilarious. Try it if you think you can. You know you're in love with me, you won't be able to do it. Of course, I was determined to do it. I decided to cut ties with both of them. It's infuriating, but when I think about it calmly, they will undoubtedly face difficulties in the future. I look forward to the day when my assured victory arrives. My name is Helen Foster, and I am 52 years old. About 15 years ago, I started living with my husband, Dan, and his daughter, Maggie. The reason I married late was none other than dedicating my life to my career. When I was younger, it was rare for a woman to climb the career ladder. Especially balancing marriage and childbirth was difficult. I worried about this in my youth and eventually resigned myself to staying single. Then, Dan appeared before me. He was a mid-career hire at my company and was my subordinate at the time. He looked much younger than his 30s and seemed cute to me. I was surprised to learn that Dan was a single father with a 6-year-old daughter, Maggie. While I was busy with work, Dan would cook meals and wait for me at home. I did the cleaning and laundry, but not having to prepare meals was a huge relief. Maggie was nervous at first, but gradually became attached to me, which was truly endearing. I feel fortunate to be in a fulfilling work environment now. A few years ago, I was promoted to an executive position, and my passion for work has only grown. I am grateful to my family for their support. Maggie is now in her 20s. She struggled with job hunting, but with my referral, she managed to secure a full-time position. I am in my 50s, and Dan has become quite the old man. Though we became a family along the way, the 15 years of accumulation are not to be taken lightly. I had assumed our peaceful family life would continue as is. The incident that led to the current situation was probably my promotion to an executive position a few years ago. When the promotion was internally decided, I was so happy that I danced all the way home. Seeing my elation, Maggie, who was a high school senior at the time, must have been puzzled. Helen the mom, what's up? You seem happy. Maggie used to call me Helen the mom. Her real mother was Mom, and I was called Helen the mom after my name, Helen. Well, something good might happen next month. Probably guessing the timing, Maggie returned to her room after that, and Dan spoke to me. Is it an internal notification? By that time, Dan had started working at a different workplace. Soon after we got married, Dan expressed a desire to change jobs. It's awkward having my wife at the same company. With that reason, he truly left the company and moved to another company as a part-time administrative staff. He was pleased with his new, easier job. But from the perspective of a full-time employee at our company, it was about half the salary. Therefore, our living expenses heavily relied on my salary. That's why I believed Dan would be happy about my promotion, as it would lead to an increase in income. Yes, it's not confirmed yet, but I might be promoted. I believe I spoke in an excited tone at that time. However, Dan's response was cold. Do you really love your job that much? Sigh. I can't understand. Saying that, he sighed. I was left speechless by his unexpected reaction. The situation worsened when the official order came through. I became a director, thereby earning a director's salary. As soon as the exact amount of the salary became clear, Dan started sulking like a child. If you're earning that much, you don't need me anymore, do you? I tried to soothe him. Don't say things like that. It's because you were there for me that I could work so hard. No matter how much I praised and flattered him, Dan remained sullen. I was quite disappointed with Dan's reaction, but hoped that time would resolve things. We had had our disagreements before, but we always managed to get along well after some time. However, Dan quit his job without discussing it with me. Your income should be enough. It was a bit shocking that he quit the easy job he claimed to have. But it was true that we could live on my salary. Our household would be supported by me alone, which seemed natural. Like a man living with his wife. Originally, I was the one paying for rent, utilities, daily expenses, and Maggie's tuition. The new expenses included Dan and Maggie's phone bills and allowance. Dan constantly nagged for an increase in his allowance. It started with $300, then $500. I finally refused when he asked to raise it to $700, but Dan was full of complaints. When I was working, I had over $1,000 to spend freely. Is this all I get now? I was appalled by Dan's selfishness. There's a limit to how much I could provide, regardless of my income. I created a detailed list of monthly payments, clearly showing the total expenses. This is how much we spend each month. See, it's just enough, isn't it? There's hardly anything left for savings. Considering our retirement, I can't give you more than this. If you want more money, you might have to find a part-time job. Dan turned his back on me with a sullen face. The childlike gestures that once seemed cute now only appeared immature and made me sad. From this point on, our relationship rapidly cooled. Now, my relationship with Dan had gradually improved, but recently, things with Maggie have been awkward. She responds when spoken to, but her replies are mostly, "Yeah," or and the conversation doesn't flow. I wondered what had changed since we used to have more engaging conversations. Even during her teenage years. I couldn't think of any reason for the change between Maggie and me. If there was any reason, it might be due to the strain between Dan and me. Since Maggie is Dan's biological daughter, it wouldn't be strange if she disliked me when seeing us at odds. Besides, Maggie is now in her 20s, no longer a child. So some degree of separation from parents is to be expected. Still, I felt a bit lonely. Then, one day, an incident occurred. It happened one night when Dan was in the bath. His phone, left on the table, rang, and a message notification appeared. I caught a glimpse of a woman's name and heart emojis on the notification screen and gasped. After much hesitation, I decided to sneak a peek at Dan's phone. Even though I believe in the importance of privacy in a marriage, I couldn't overlook what I saw. The pattern lock on Dan's phone was simple, and I had memorized it just by seeing it. Upon checking, I found out that Dan had become a regular at a so-called casual bar, smitten with one of the girls there. The email from a young woman, presumably using a stage name, read, "Thanks for the birthday present. Please pamper me more. Definitely, come to the bar waiting for you." A chill ran through me. Was it just a business email, or something more? My imagination ran wild with negative thoughts as I closed the screen. Feeling nauseous, I left the living room, intending to go to the bathroom. But I became so weak that I sat down in the hallway. Then, Maggie came out of the bathroom and stopped in her tracks when she saw me. "What are you doing?" Barely lifting her face, she speaks in a puzzled voice. Maggie suddenly appeared right in front of me, seemingly the only ally I had. "You know, I think Dan might be cheating on me." My words came out in broken phrases, only to be met with further insult. Upon hearing me, Maggie scoffed in disbelief. Huh, so what? It's because you're not attractive. He can't love a 50-year-old woman anymore, just give up. I was shocked by the words of Maggie, whom I had always considered my daughter, even though we were not related by blood. I covered my face and cried as Maggie walked past me briskly. Around that time, I was about to go on a business trip. With a heavy heart, I left for a 3-day trip, pondering the future. I didn't want to forgive the affair. But perhaps the other woman was only involved with Dan for work purposes. I thought that if I told Dan how much I disliked it and we had a discussion, he might understand. With that hope in my heart, I returned home, only to drop my luggage in astonishment as soon as I entered. The house was empty. Almost all the furniture and appliances were gone. In a panic, I rushed to my home office, which thankfully remained untouched. However, Maggie's room was completely empty. Dan's clothes and the model kits he collected for his hobby were all gone as well. I think I was in a daze for about an hour. When I realized it, I was crying profusely. Still unable to comprehend the situation, I hurriedly called Dan. He answered the phone with a nonchalant tone. Maggie decided to leave the house, so I followed her. Of course. We want to live with our real family, right? Oh, and we're keeping the furniture and stuff. It's only right that the ones with more people take it. Dan spoke as if it were the most natural thing in the world, leaving me speechless. What does Maggie say? Then, Maggie came on the phone. She sounded annoyed. What's going on? Where are you now? I barely managed to ask the question. Maggie snorted. If you're okay with a maid, I'll give you my address. Her laughter-laden remark made me collapse onto the floor. I couldn't even bring myself to sit up, just laying there listening to Maggie's voice. I've got a job now, so I don't need your measly salary. We can live just fine with Dad, and you can take back your housekeeping slacking old lady. It wasn't that I had been neglecting housework, I had simply delegated some tasks to Dan. Yet, why did I deserve to be spoken to like this? My job was demanding, and inevitably, I got home late. I had asked Dan to take care of cooking breakfast and dinner, a task he volunteered for at the beginning of our marriage, claiming he was good at cooking. But that was all he did. I took care of cleaning and laundry early in the morning or on weekends. I was aware that women of my age might do more housework. Of course, I was working, but I still felt a bit inferior. That's why I had always forgiven Dan, even though he was unemployed and spent all the allowance I gave him on entertainment. I was also struck by how Maggie seemed completely unaware of my contributions. For 15 years, I had been the main provider for the family. But it seemed she hadn't considered that at all. I didn't know what Dan had told her, but was it my fault for not explaining things in detail? Say something. I'm hanging up, okay? Maggie's condescending words and the sound of Dan laughing in the background made me realize that they were discarding me and laughing about it. At that moment, something inside me cooled completely. Then, I want a divorce from the unemployed loser husband. I said it directly to Maggie. Just moments ago, I had hoped for reconciliation. But now my heart was entirely detached from them both. Unemployed? Maggie makes a strange noise. She sounded surprised, as if she was unaware of Dan's situation. I suppose I have no choice but to explain it simply. Dan is unemployed. He had been working part-time as an office assistant for a long time. But he quit when I got promoted. I'm pretty sure he's not even working part-time now. My answer seemed to confuse Maggie. Her next words made me faintly understand what was happening. Huh? The part-time job was yours, right? You've been leeching off Dad's salary. I felt like slapping my knee in realization. The fading end of her sentence probably meant to continue with something like, "I had heard that." Was Dan the one who misled Maggie? If she knew the truth, could Maggie come back to her senses? Clinging to a sliver of hope, I attempted to persuade her. After we got married, Dan quit his job immediately. Since then, he's been a part-time office assistant for over 10 years. I don't know what you've been told, but you need to wake up. That's a lie. Dad has become richer than before, he's been buying me everything. Don't get cocky just because you're a fake parent. That's impossible. The truth I revealed seemed to shock Maggie. But a moment of groaning suggested she was far from coming to her senses. I continued explaining with a sigh, half giving up on mending our relationship. It seemed like he was wealthy because he spent his entire salary on allowances. Thanks to me covering all living expenses, Dan hasn't contributed a single penny to the household. I've been working since I was young, and now I'm an executive. My income is high. Only her breathing was audible from the other end of the phone. Maggie seemed to be in shock. Then, I heard her voice, sounding a bit distant. Wait, she's saying Dad's unemployed, but that can't be true, right? What, really? Huh? It seemed she was speaking to Dan away from the phone. As I eavesdropped, intrigued by the unfolding drama, Maggie's voice grew fainter, and then Dan took over the call. Hey, what did you tell Maggie? She's freaking out over here. His relaxed tone was infuriating. After running off with everything from the house, not a word of apology or explanation came from him. I didn't bother hiding my irritation as I lashed out at Dan. I just told her you're unemployed. If you two are living together, she was bound to find out. What have you been telling her? She seemed to think I was the part-timer. And what about this house? Taking everything without permission is insane. I expected some form of apology, but Dan showed no remorse. Without offering any defense, he made an even more absurd remark. Don't be petty. You can just buy whatever you need again, you have the money. Oh, right. I'll give you the details for the rent transfer, so take notes. What an utterly misguided statement. After taking everything and leaving, he still expected to rely on my income. Shocked, I hadn't fully checked, but they might have taken the bank cards as well. Now fully composed, I got up from the floor, my indignation fueling a firm stance. As I told Maggie, I'll be filing for divorce from you. That's funny. His carefree laughter made me press my temples. I felt a surge of anger at my husband's obliviousness to the severity of our situation. Try it if you can. You know you're in love with me, you won't be able to do it. Dan speaks with a triumphant tone. But in my heart, I thought, of course, I can. Love was until yesterday. After such treatment, 1,000 years of love could turn cold in an instant. To have spent so much time with someone so clueless was truly unbelievable. Is that so? Well then. With my usual calm voice, I spoke quietly. Ignoring Dan's attempt to say more, I hung up the phone. Then, I turned off my smartphone. I needed some quiet time to think. I made sure the noisy phone wouldn't ring. Now that my mind had cooled, I regained my composure. Although I was furious, thinking calmly, I was overwhelmingly at an advantage. They would undoubtedly face difficulties ahead. The days of waiting for a guaranteed victory were just beginning. The next day, when I turned on my smartphone, there was already a message from Maggie. Please forgive me, let me come back home. I refuse. Weren't you going to live with your real father? I responded dispassionately. It's pathetic how quickly she's changed her mind. Then, Maggie blurted out something desperate. I'll leave that man, so please. The rent for my current room is too high. I could never afford it on my own. I only believed him because that useless father said he would handle the rent and everything else. I'm the victim here. There were so many issues with her statement that I honestly didn't know where to start. The audacity to claim she's a victim. Has she forgotten how she mocked me? Not just this incident. What did she say about Dan's suspected affair? She acts as though she's forgotten everything, which is unforgivable. Her lack of independence, even as an adult, and the ugliness of cursing her own father. Everything was beyond the pale. I will not help you. You are not welcome in my home. Don't ever show your face to me again. I hung up the phone with a slam and set it to block incoming calls. I also blocked Dan's number for good measure. That evening, when I returned home, Dan and Maggie were waiting outside the house. Dan looked sullen, seemingly dragged here by Maggie. I had the locks changed in a hurry yesterday, so they couldn't get in. Likely waiting outside as a result. Anticipating their arrival. I pushed past Maggie rushing towards me and thrust the divorce papers at Dan. File this now. Let's get this over with quickly. Dan, frightened by my genuine anger, quietly received the papers. Submitting these would mean I could revert to my maiden name, Thompson, after 15 years with the surname Foster. I tried not to show my relief as I informed them. I've already consulted a lawyer. We'll discuss the division of assets before I submit this. Unwillingly, since we've been together for 15 years, we'll split everything from that period in half. Their mood instantly brightened. Even Maggie, who seemed so keen on my forgiveness, was now holding hands with Dan. Both of them beaming with joy. It confirmed my suspicion that they weren't truly seeking forgiveness, but were after the assets. However, this was my trap. I told them coldly. Premarital assets are not subject to division. There's hardly any savings since expenses have been high after marriage. Of course. I'll be filing a separate claim for damages due to your selfish behavior happened these days. After offsetting the costs of the furniture and appliances you took. Your share might amount to just a few hundreds. Maggie was dumbfounded, her eyes wide in shock. Dan looked from Maggie to me, flustered. I wondered if I was overdoing it, but I couldn't bring myself to back down. I've covered all of Maggie's tuition, but I won't demand that back. Consider it a thank you for making me feel like a mother, even if just for a while. However, I will be explaining the situation to Maggie's employer. They hired her on my recommendation. After all, it's only fair they know we're no longer family. Maggie's complexion had gone beyond pale to completely white. It seems she genuinely didn't know about the tuition or the job referral. Dan had said, let's not tell Maggie about the job referral. It would be pitiful if she worried unnecessarily, so I hadn't mentioned it. But in hindsight, that was a mistake. I left them there, getting into my car. The house was empty and full of bad memories anyway. I had planned to stay at a hotel tonight. Later, before submitting the divorce papers, I filed for damages through a lawyer, citing Dan's behaviors that disregarded marital agreements. Having discovered the name of the bar, I personally visited Dan's favorite worker. In exchange for not filing a lawsuit, I gathered ample evidence of the affair. I didn't let the worker off entirely, making a bit of a comeback by informing her parents of her deeds. Eventually, she was forced to leave both her job and school, returning to her hometown. I'm grateful to the detective agency for their thorough investigation. Months later, Dan and Maggie were quickly in dire straits. I temporarily lifted the call block on my phone, allowing myself to listen to their voicemail messages. Dan's messages were pleas for money. They had moved to a cheaper place, but it still wasn't enough. Maggie also left a tearful message on my voicemail. Of course, I didn't respond or call back. After several messages, it shifted from life is hard to I'm in debt from struggling to live. Dad just lazes around without working. I had no idea he was such a leech. I was utterly appalled by Dan's thick skin. Hearing Maggie sobbing did momentarily shake me. But the messages that followed contained not a single word of apology, just self-centered pleas. Please take this guy back, I'm struggling. I didn't sign up for this. The fact that she couldn't even think to apologize to me made me decide she wasn't worth helping. Moreover, her readiness to abandon her own father deepened my disillusionment. If she could discard her biological father and me, her foster mother, so easily, what did that say about her? I wondered if it was my fault for how she turned out. But I also doubted that I alone was responsible for raising such a character. Dan must be the root of all evil, or so I'd like to think. Just when I hoped this would be the end of it, Dan and Maggie showed up at my workplace seeking reconciliation. I had expected them to come to the house again and had set up cameras in anticipation. But them showing up at my company was unforeseen. To avoid causing a disturbance, I escorted them to a conference room and apologized to my colleagues before starting the discussion. I'm truly sorry for causing a commotion over personal matters, everyone. My colleagues didn't blame me, in fact, they were more concerned for me. I really have some great colleagues. Some of them remembered Dan from his less impressive days at the company and offered their sympathy with a pat on the shoulder. Bolstered by my colleagues' support, I prepared my smartphone as a voice recorder and faced the two of them. Helen, let's start over. Mom, forgive me, please take him back. He told me to support him. And I can't live carrying this burden. As soon as I opened the conference room door, Dan and Maggie raised their voices in unison. Their loud protests echoed not just outside the room but down the hallway. Don't they feel any shame? Ignoring Dan, I decided to speak with Maggie first. You chose to leave with your father to live together, didn't you? Don't start being selfish now, Maggie. As I spoke calmly, Maggie looked down, tears in her eyes, searching for words. Eventually, she began to speak, her voice heavy. It's different. I thought Dad was rich, and he would provide for me. I thought I could have an easy life. Sighing deeply at the revelation it was all for money. Maggie seemed to realize my stance was unforgiving and hurriedly continued. But it was him who said he'd come with me. I was just deceived. Please, Mom, help me. Who's a mom? I said sharply. You always called me, Helen the mom, to differentiate from your real mom. Don't call me Mom just when it's convenient for you. And don't talk about relying on your parents' money for an easy life. You're an adult with a job now, support yourself. I found myself scolding her like she was still a child. Maggie was inconsolable, but no amount of tears could thaw my frozen heart. I realized I was speaking in a surprisingly cold voice. I don't consider someone who cozies up for money as family. Changing attitudes based on whether there's money involved means the person isn't valued more than the money. You should stop taking people for granted. The air seemed to freeze. Maggie stopped sniffling as if holding her breath. Turning to Dan, who was looking nervous, I didn't hold back. You want to start over? That's repulsive. Haven't you realized you're disliked? Why not stay with that girl from the bar? She's a college student. 2 years younger than Maggie, right? Dan sulked in his typical way when things didn't go his way, a clear sign of his discomfort. Next to him, Maggie was glaring at Dan with disbelief. Seemingly unaware his affair was with someone younger than herself. No, come on, that was just work, right? It doesn't count as cheating. Oh, are you jealous? You wanted to be lovey-dovey with me, huh? I was exasperated with Dan, who started to smirk despite his pale face. It's hard to believe I once loved this man. I'd like to go back 15 years and warn myself about my terrible taste. As I stood up, losing any desire to speak further, Dan clung to me. "Don't touch me, you're filthy." I must have looked at him with eyes cold as a Tibetan fox. "By the way, why did you let Maggie think you were the one supporting the household?" When I voiced my curiosity, Dan mumbled another excuse. "Well, it would look bad, wouldn't it? A father being outdone by the mother." "I just said it, that's all." "Forgive me, please." I nearly snapped at him, remembering just in time that I was recording. I wanted to stay composed, not let him disturb my peace. "If you're talking about income, I don't think it's about winning or losing. Being a house husband could have been a respectable job if you'd done it properly." I thought to myself that it was just cooking he was doing, anyway. I had hoped he'd take on more chores after quitting his job. But cleaning and laundry remained my tasks. "He's not a house husband, he just sleeps. He cooks, but it's half-hearted. And he doesn't do any other housework at all. And he's unemployed." It seemed Maggie was now taking on the chores, or perhaps both were neglecting them. I was glad she got to experience a bit of my struggle. "What? How dare you speak to your parent like that?" Dan and Maggie started blaming each other, showing their worst sides. It was astounding they had left together, only to end up like this. Eventually, they stood up and began to physically fight. I screamed in shock and backed away, opening the door. The commotion and voices had attracted my colleagues from outside to come in. Surrounded by them, Dan and Maggie fell silent. "Director Foster, are you all right? Would you like us to call security?" Hearing this, Maggie's eyes widened. Since only subordinates were present, they all treated me with respect. Realizing the truth at last, Maggie slumped down. It was true. Helen the mom is someone important. Maggie's dejection almost made me feel sorry for her, though I couldn't bring myself to help. However, in the next moment, Maggie transformed into a demon. "Liar, you said we were living off of me. Saying Helen's earnings were just a little. That was a lie, you lying old man." She lunged at Dan with a demonic fury, even going as far as to grab his neck. Male colleagues managed to pull her off just in time. Security arrived and restrained Maggie while Dan crawled away. Later, I heard from a colleague that Dan had visible scratch marks and handprints on his neck. After Dan fled, Maggie was eventually escorted out. I apologized to everyone present for the disturbance, feeling embarrassed that such people were once my family. My colleagues all expressed their concern for me. "Let's get back to work." I decided to resume my duties, taking out my phone to stop the recording. Despite the embarrassing commotion, I felt a sense of relief. 2 days later, relaxing at home, I received a call from the police. They informed me Dan had assaulted Maggie, causing injury. Dan did that to Maggie? Not the other way around? Maggie is the victim? Really? I repeated my question, remembering how Maggie had rampaged in the conference room. The police seemed to chuckle, sensing something was off. They told me Dan wanted me to be his guarantor. Maggie, now the victim, also wanted my help. I must decline both requests. We are already divorced and thus strangers. Maggie was his stepdaughter, and she chose to leave as well. Due to this incident, Dan was disowned by his own family and became homeless. It seems Maggie forgave him, leading to no charges, but he vanished soon after. I heard rumors about a homeless man who looks a lot like your ex-husband sleeping on the streets. But the truth of these rumors is unknown. Maggie's injuries were serious, leading to substantial medical bills and further financial difficulties. Eventually, she was caught shoplifting due to her dire situation. When she called to ask me to be her guarantor again, I firmly reiterated our estrangement. Maggie had lost her full-time job due to her misdeeds being discovered by her company. Please help me. Because I had blocked her calls, Maggie ended up calling the office, pleading through her tears. My heart remained unmoved, fully aware of her self-centered nature. You are causing a disturbance at work, which is unacceptable. If you continue to disrupt our operations, I will have to report you to the police. You are a stranger to me now, understand? After hearing a sharp intake of breath from Maggie, she hastily ended the call. Though I doubted such a threat was enforceable, the bluff worked wonders. Since then, I've received no further contact from her. The last I heard of Maggie was from a male colleague who tentatively inquired, "Could this be your daughter?" He showed me a website for a nightclub, featuring a woman with flashy hair unmistakably resembling Maggie. Oh, she does look similar. But she was only my ex-husband's child, not strictly my daughter. Well, if she's working hard, no matter the job, that's probably fine. I spoke as gently as possible, keeping my tone soft. Since then, I've continued living a carefree solo life. The house we lived in as three was too big, so I quickly moved to a well-secured apartment. Now, even if Dan or Maggie tries to visit, they won't be able to reach me. It's ironic, though. I've always been credited with having a good eye for my subordinates at work. Yet it seems I was blind in my personal life. To think I didn't see their true natures for 15 years, I still have much to learn. I thought I'd stay single for a while, but as soon as I mentioned my divorce, a wonderful man I met through work asked me out to dinner. He's a year older than me, a calm person. He's an executive at a client company, and I greatly respect his work ethic. He seems to appreciate my professional achievements as well, valuing my dedication to work. Surprisingly, we share similar tastes. Discovering a mutual appreciation for films by the same director. Perhaps we might go watch a new release together soon. The anticipation of a new romance makes me feel slightly rejuvenated.